Hey, this is John. Today I want to talk predominantly about Harry Frankfurt's article that got turned into a book on bullshit. But really, I'm going to be using that to kind of scaffold from to talk about the issue in a more broad sense because it's pretty important. I think it's getting more important as more information circulates, and a lot of that information is still terrible. So, that's what we're going to talk about today. And obviously, if you like the video, please like and subscribe. And also, I'm doing a thing still since the last video where I mentioned a book that I'm reading every week at the start of the video to help combat the literacy crisis, generate interest around reading. So, this week's book is Demian by Hermann Hesse. It's a relatively short book about a young man who's reflecting on life, and he's describing differences in his viewpoints in terms of worlds. Basically, one of the characters, Demian, is an obvious reference to the daemon, and that is illustrated largely through his discussions about the story of Cain and Abel as being in favor of acquiring power. So, anyways, into the actual video now. So some important points to mention is that the book for Harry Frankfurt's book, was originally intended for an academic audience, and so there's a lot of it dedicated to just discerning what exactly he's talking about when he says bullshit, right? And the point of the book is to create a framework for that, or at least to start that discussion in a systematic way. So, one of the things that I'd really like people to consider as we kind of talk about the issue is that we are not exactly isolated individuals. We exist in a society, and so the effect that other people have on our society does get reflected onto us, basically, especially when it's en masse, because then it changes the mass behavior of that society. So, which is kind of obvious, of course, when I say that, but the point is that in general, the bullshit proliferating in society lowers the standard for information and gives people influence to make decisions based on information that does not care about whatever the facts are. And that's bad for everyone when that happens in aggregate. So it was interesting to read the essay in hindsight of things that I had already believed and, typically tell people. Actually, and I've been finding that a lot lately. Perhaps sort of a joking manner, I find myself saying, wow, these philosophers really agree with me sometimes. But yeah, a lot of the essay does seem like it's practically ripped from my own thoughts in that manner, which is basically the public consensus on many matters is largely divided because the audience can't discern the truth of the matter. And I would say that's not quite something that Harry Frankfurt talks about, is that the audience is ill-equipped necessarily. I guess he kind of mentions that at the beginning, but I don't think he really digs into that enough. But a lot of issues in the public space are painted as contentious when, to be totally honest, some of them are not even really up for debate by any serious academics or professionals in the area. Not really. And so a lot of the public discussion is people siding with personalities that they like because they don't have the expertise to discern that. And I'll give an example of exactly what I mean as the video progresses. One thing that I would say though, and sometimes I think I can be probably kind of mean, of course. I can't help it sometimes. But I do try my best to separate people from their actions. And I don't think it's everyone's fault necessarily that, you know, bullshit spreads around, or that they, have to side with personalities, because there's obviously constraints on everyone's time and will to do certain things. But there is an interesting problem to kind of dig into here, which is, as you may or may not have experienced in your own life, when you are discussing something with somebody and they've inherited ideas, I believe, from their favorite influencers, and for whatever reason, there's not really any getting through to that person in that discussion. I think to offer, my own thoughts on that matter, I think it's basically a combination of two issues. The first is that this is probably the first time, if you are confronting these people, that they're actually experiencing serious objections to those positions that they held. And given how long they may or may not have been holding those beliefs, it's not like I'm going to say one thing that gets them to, deconstruct everything that they believed for so long. Even if I'm objectively right. Now, part of that problem is also that there's careful media management of presumably the personalities that they most identify with, in that you don't typically see them losing debates when they're in the public space. I'm sure that, for example, when Steven Crowder shows up to the university campuses, he probably removes any discussions that he's completely lost. And even aside from that, I mean, there's a lot of other, little tricks that they use to place pressure on the opposition to make mistakes. And for example, on another person, the person that I referenced in the welfare video was Ben Shapiro. I wasn't going to say that initially, but it's interesting to look at that argument, not because it's an interesting argument, but because when I looked at the data and I had him kind of in mind regarding, the sort of yapping he's done about welfare and single motherhood rates, for example, there basically isn't even a starting point to that argument. So there isn't really, well, I mean, there's no other words to really say there. You can watch the video. I put the data into Excel. I believe it's from the U.S. Census Bureau. The argument has no grounds at all. So, and if you're not familiar with this whole spiel about single motherhood rates and welfare, don't worry about that. But that's just one example. So, anyways, that's one issue, right? One issue is, it's probably the first time they're experiencing serious objections. Then the other one, though, is related to sense of worth and, I guess, respect, right? That we feel the need, and this is actually something that Harry Frankfurt talks about as well, as one suggestion, is the need to give an opinion on things, whether we, know or don't know what we're talking about. And I would say that in some sense, a person's sense of self-worth is contingent on their ability to articulate themselves and reason and think in a society, right? That I have the ability to come to, of my own free will, good views. Okay. So I think with that in mind, one thing that I've noticed is that a lot of people still want to, leave a discussion and go and do their own research thereafter, whether they know what proper research looks like or otherwise, because it gives a sense of self-discovery to the process, right? That you are reaching your own conclusions, not John is telling me what to think. So that does suck, just to be honest, because I do think that this generally causes an unbelievable amount of problems. But then again, I do think that this was what Socrates was apologizing for. So should I really be surprised? Probably not. Okay, anyways. So what does he actually mean when he says bullshit, though? Well, he goes through a few different definitions. He starts off with Black's answer, which is basically not quite lying, but still deceptive and incorrect. And one important inclusion in the discussion that he makes here is that he groups implied beliefs meant to deceive in the bullshit. So, for example, he uses the example of like money in the pocket. But another example that would be if I say that my shoes are blue, but they're actually red. Then, although I don't say I believe my shoes are blue, it's very reasonable to assume that I do believe that my shoes are blue when I make that statement. So, because of the very obvious implication, or that I can assume that you're going to assume that that's implied, I've lied twice, or I've also deceived you about my beliefs and the state of the shoes. So the reason why that's actually important, in my view at least, is because I think it does get rid of a lot of semantical arguments. And I mean, I've devoted, I'm not going to say a considerable effort to the proof of definitions that I sort of kind of generalized in the comment section on the like Stalin Marxism, Stalin socialism video. But one of the biggest reasons why I actually did create that proof in sort of a private essay was because there is so many, a lot of the public debate is focused, or has been very focused for a while, on, hey, I'm gonna change the meaning of the words that I use in an argument from their commonly held definitions so that I can get you to agree to something that isn't actually what I'm saying when I make that statement. And that's just pseudo-intellectual bullshit. So that's why I did that primarily, but it was also part of an important unpublished proof. My dog ate my homework. Anyways, okay. So people can lie twice. Once about the actual state of affairs, once about the beliefs that they hold. Okay. Now, at this point, it's worth mentioning that one of the opening statements that Harry Frankfurt makes is that, and I think this is important as well, people often believe themselves to be good detectors of this bullshit, um, regardless of their actual standing. But that something is bullshit doesn't depend on the measure of the meticulousness with which it's constructed. So some of it can be very carefully crafted, right? Not always, but so for example, some statements are very easy to pick apart. There was apparently recently Mark Andreessen, who was the guy who lied about being debanked for political reasons, even though that doesn't make any sense because the federal, like the FDC takes care of that, doesn't actually do that, right? Like, it doesn't make financial sense for them anyways, or the economy, or it doesn't make any sense. So apparently, though, he also came out and made a statement that he is rarely introspective on a podcast, and he makes it a lot funnier, though, by saying that introspection was only really invented in like the last 100 years.
And you probably know, if you go back before 100 years ago, it never would have occurred to anybody to be introspective. Like, it's the whole idea of, just all of the modern conceptions around introspection and therapy and all the things that kind of result from that are, kind of manufactured in the 1910s, 1920s.
And there's so this is very easy to pick apart. There's not even really any thing to say about that. It disproves itself, basically. With the fact, for example, that like there's Greek philosophers, like it doesn't make any sense. It's ridiculous. Now, on the other hand, though, there are harder cases that do require some expertise. So I've talked about the Project 2025 handbook a few times now. For example, the people that wrote that do have PhDs, right? That doesn't exempt them from making silly statements, apparently, like exports don't contribute to GDP. And they said net GDP, it doesn't make any difference. That's literally one of the inputs into the GDP. It doesn't make any sense. So, and then scaffolding from that to make what I call the king of the castle argument. Another example, though, of this was when I was in my neuroscience undergrad, and we were going through a paper on, basically somebody was talking about the different components in a cigarette, and one of the things that they said was that nicotine is not addictive, or it wasn't the main addictive ingredient. That's very easy to disprove when you know what you're talking about, because it literally binds to the nicotinic acetylcholine receptors, right? Might just be nicotinic receptors. Anyways, whatever. But ACH is the result. That leads to dopamine down the line. It's very easy and rudimentary to show that doesn't make any sense, like just from basic theory, right? But if you don't have any basic theory, how can you possibly know that that's true or not true? I mean, you'd have to take it at face value or guess. So, case in point. Anyways, after that, he then goes on to examine Wittgenstein's description of bullshit, or at least his likely interpretation of it, which is to say that statements that are not literally true or wholly accurate as a concern. So it doesn't matter about the accuracy when interpreting it with Wittgenstein. What does matter, though, is the intention. Is it intended to be true? Does it have a concern for the truth? And if it doesn't, then it's bullshit. And then he goes down, and that's kind of the main premise anyways, but then he uses Pound to ascertain that bullshitting is more close to bluffing than lying, and because, lying is necessarily false, bullshitting is not necessarily. Okay. So, just to recap that, the point is that when we say bullshit, we just mean statements that are not concerned with the truth. They don't make any effort to be true. They are typically trying to achieve some kind of goal, for example. So one thing that I could say, if I was trying to get people to buy my investment course, so I could say, wow, I don't have an investment course, by the way. I could take, snippets of my stock portfolio and pick the very best ones. I could maybe even show it as a lifetime view and make the graph very small so people can't see, whatever. I could rent a Lamborghini for an hour, for 10 minutes, whatever, it doesn't matter. And I could say, oh geez, I've made so much money. And it doesn't matter if it's literally true. The point is, and maybe it is true, maybe I bought a Lamborghini, whatever, it doesn't matter. Because the point is in the goal of the outcome that I'm trying to achieve with the statement, which is to convince you that I'm, some successful investor based on none of the markers that matter, frankly. But yeah. Okay, so that's out of the way. Now, Harry Frankfurt tries to explain why there's so much bullshit. And I think there's, an important caveat to what he says here, which is that, this was actually written in the early 2000s. So I think a lot's changed since then, although I do think that his 2 points hold up. I think it's easier to see why some of the, why there is so much now, though. So one is that he believes, in social conventions kind of being the issue, right? Where, people feel the need to speak on matters of which they are arrogant on, and everyone should have an opinion on certain matters without necessarily constructing one. Now, I don't think that's how anyone should really behave, and I think it is senseless, right? And when I say it like that, you want to comment on things that you haven't had the time to think about or even actually form an opinion on yourself because you don't have enough information, you don't have sufficient reasons, you haven't thought about those reasons. Maybe you've heard things from people on the internet who don't actually know what they're talking about. They say they've been studying something for 20 years, for example, and they get things that are fundamental aspects to that theory wrong, and you don't know any better. Are those really the things you want to talk about? So, frankly, because it probably sounds like I can talk about a lot of things, and I can, but I'm also better well-read than Mark Andreessen's friend. I just say I don't know about that when I don't know what I'm talking about. That's it. It's very simple. I don't know about that. So then, people can try. The second point, though, is that he ascribes it to anti-realist philosophy, which is the idea that we can't possibly know some things, right? And he, describes this sort of destructive because sometimes people give up on the accuracy of their statements with it in mind that they can't be fully accurate anyways. And I definitely agree with that to some extent. I think probably that could be having downstream effects, for example, in the way that we, discuss the use of language in some of these discussions, right? Like, well, we can't know for certain what exactly it means, so we got to waste time defining things that are relatively obvious and get away from what we actually commonly know them to mean, for example. Yeah. Now, I don't think that the public necessarily cares about this so much, or that, people en masse are thinking about anti-realist philosophy when they're in discussions with you. But yeah. Now, I would add that probably a very easy explanation in light of bullshit being aimed at goals is that one of the reasons why this is so common now is because of business interests. Businesses have reasons to put certain things out there, and often they lobby via politics, for example. So I think it's really unsurprising why we get so much bullshit given that. I'll also add that, the consumers of this information, just in general, and, if you think this isn't you, I'd really like you to, second guess yourself. Because, on one hand, right, yeah, there's obviously like the political issues, but one thing that might suggest that people are just generally not concerned enough about these kinds of problems is that market research has shown that about 70% of your customers are going to stick around and be repeat customers pretty much no matter how bad you treat them, which is pretty interesting. Anyways, it suggests that people have a lot of inertia to, perhaps abandon their current positions, right? In addition to not having the expertise to, really kind of discern them in the first place. So, on a last point, I do agree that bullshit is probably more harmful than lying, because by its lack of concern for the truth, it can go, it can give it, the output is much faster and can, just proliferate at a much quicker rate, right? If I don't care about the truth value of what I'm saying, I just say whatever, it doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be carefully constructed. I don't have to think, well, how do I work backwards from a convincing point of view and use that to think about the issue. Given that, the way that he talks about liars is that they think from the position of truth and deconstructing it. The bullshitter doesn't. They just make stuff up. So, anyways, that was surprisingly longer than I thought it was going to be. Yeah. I hope that was enjoyable. Bye.